Hi guys, sorry I can't be here again tonight, but welcome to week 3 of what I'm calling Foundations. Some vital principles from Genesis that help explain how the world works and why it works. You know, last week we looked at the idea of opposition and the fact that we do have opposition against anyone and any thing that's trying to do God's plan. Talked about that. This week, I think, is one of the more important principles I've ever learned in my life, and that's the idea of community. I mean, as we look in Genesis, we see that God, even in the very first part, says, "Let us make man in our own image," and we see that God Himself presents Himself as community, as being a three-in-one God that is complete in Himself. But then He decided to make man, which again is the whole idea of community, that even God wanted some more in addition to Himself. The verse that we're going to look at tonight's the key one, and that's Genesis chapter 2 and verse 18. God has made Adam, and we see that in verse 18 it says this. It says, "The Lord God said, 'It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him.'" And if you read the rest of the chapter, you all know the story where God causes Adam to go to sleep, and then He makes Eve. And He presents Eve to Adam as a present, as a gift. I'm not a Hebrew expert, but they tell me in the original Hebrew that the actual language is exciting, and it expresses excitement when Adam met and first talked about Eve. So man was meant to live in community. As you look rest in Genesis, I'm not going to go over all the verses, but you see that we have the family coming along with Adam and Eve having children. And then we find very soon after that there's the forming of cities. Although, again, cities in the original language can mean anything from just a small tribe or village all the way to a large city. So when you see the word city there in the early part of Genesis, it doesn't mean that we had population centers of 10,000 or 100,000. It could have been a little village or tribe as small as just 10 or 20 people. But man did congregate together. As we go on through the Old Testament, we find that with the children of Israel, that God formed them into 12 tribes. Not just one tribe or not just one population, but 12 tribes. And that's important because there's the idea through the Old Testament that everybody doesn't do everything. That's part of the whole thing that you see in Genesis when God made Eve. He said about Adam, "It's not good for man to be alone." That's important for us to realize because Adam was made perfect. But even perfect, before sin entered the world, when there was not a flaw in Adam according to God's judgment, still God said it wasn't good for him to be alone. Even being a perfect man, he couldn't do everything, and he needed more. He needed some help, and I don't want to get into this a whole lot. Maybe I should be glad I'm not here tonight, so my wife can't comment directly to me about this. But I did a little research because it called Eve a helper. In the old King James, they call him a helpmate. But I did some research just because of that word. It's a little troubling sometimes because when I think of a helper, I think of like a master carpenter that has a helper that brings him nails and boards. Think of a helper as slightly inferior. So I looked at the original language and found out that in Hebrew there were actually 3 words for helper. And the word for helper, like servant or assistant, is absolutely not the word used here in Genesis. The word that God used to describe Eve as a helper, if you trace it, you find that most all the other references are where someone in the Old Testament is describing God as my help or my strength. And we find that the word doesn't mean helper in the sense of, "Hey, bring me a sandwich." It means helper in the sense of someone who provides almost a salvation or a rescue. It's someone who provides what the person who needs the help absolutely cannot do themselves. So it's a strong language there in Genesis, where Adam, even though he was perfect, there were some things he absolutely could not do, and he needed another human as his rescuer or his help. And that, again, that idea carries out through the whole Bible, and the idea of community. Now for you guys, we're going to do it a little differently tonight. I was busy this week, and I'd also thought about doing this anyway, so I wanted to have a week where instead of a paper with a lot of blanks to fill in, you just get a blank sheet of paper, you get some verses, and I ask you guys to have a discussion. In the discussion, I want you to look at some ideas. The same thing that we have here in Genesis. The idea is, as we look at some verses about community, can people do everything themselves? It's the idea of what is the community designed to do, and what is the help that we see here? What's the interdependence that we see here? What kind of humility is required? And then the idea of love. The Christian community that we see is different than that in the Old Testament, and that it's not bound together by duty or by birth like a lot of the Old Testament. It's bound together by love. So with that in mind, I want to give you 3 passages, and I want you guys to kind of look at them and have a discussion and see what you find from it. I'll read these a couple of times so that as we read it, you guys can come up with the idea yourself of what is God trying to tell us as a church to do in this situation. Now, one of them is John, the Gospel of John, chapter 13. So that's John 13, and verses 34 and 35. It's a famous one talking about love, but I want you to see exactly for us as a Christian community, what is the importance of love, and then even talk about what do you think the signs of love are there. How do you think that we actually show love? And if you really want to get deep about it, discuss the idea of when somebody in our community or our group is a little bit difficult, challenging, whatever you want to describe to live with or deal with. What do you think love? What do you think the reaction and the response is to that? And then the other one, and I'll go short so you guys can enjoy a little Cinco de Mayo time, but the other one is Ephesians. Okay, Ephesians chapter 4, Ephesians 4, and in verses 10 through 13. And there God talks about the fact that He provided different gifts into the church. And if you look, these gifts are not things. These gifts aren't even abilities. These gifts are people. And again, the idea of what is God trying to tell us in the question or the fact of, is there really anybody that's in the church that's optional? Or is everybody have a purpose? And if so, how are some ways we go about finding that purpose? So look at those 2 scriptures. Have a great time with the discussion. And I hope to be with you next week so you can tell me then what you think of the videos and what kind of discussion format you want to have in the future. Thanks, and God bless you guys.